Today I wanted to do just a little more talk about the Embers of the Imperium, which is the Twilight Imperium 4 role-playing game, which is originally forecast to come out last summer. It did not come out last summer, so it was projected maybe at the end of the year, but now it sounds like not till the end of next year. And from what I've heard, it has to do with, I guess, COVID-related sort of issues on distribution and shipping and getting the covers made. And, you know, I'm not sure all the details exactly, but it looks like a huge delay on the game. So what had been announced in the summer was a release of a 40-page module, which would be given out for free RPG Day. And this is called the Ashes of Power. And so what this is supposed to do is be kind of a preview of what the game would be like. Now, for me, it's a little bit sad that everything's being delayed, just because I actually wanted to do streamed playthroughs of Embers of the Imperium, but that'll have to wait quite a while, it sounds like. But I thought, at least because the PDF came out today, well, not the PDF is not out yet, but the Ashes of Power, the 40-page module, was technically released today. And how this works for Free RPG Day, what it sounds like, because none of my local stores are part of this, but apparently stores can choose to participate in this Free RPG Day. And this would sort of, it seems like, be a promotion where, you know, they'd have free stuff they could hand out and get people to come to their store and things like that. So Edge Studio has not yet released the PDF version of Ashes of Power, the module, which makes sense because that would pretty much interfere with the store's promotional effort. So it looks like it might be, they said, a few months maybe before they release it in the PDF form, but hopefully that'll still be free. I imagine it will be, because this is supposed to be kind of getting people excited for the release, which is already delayed quite a bit. But because that's the thing I've been waiting to talk about, and I don't really have much to talk about, I've scraped up what I can, just so I can have something to say. So there is somebody on Reddit. Here, I'm going to share screen with the Reddit page. Guess not, because I've already closed it. So instead of going that, I'm just going to go to the Ashes of Power PDFs. So as somebody on Reddit, and I think his name was, oh shoot, Drain Snake, Drain Power, or something like that. I'm so sorry to the gentleman who posted these for us. But anyways, so he posted the character sheets that were that I guess came with the module. So we can at least take a glimpse a little bit of what's going on here. So they released 4 characters. So these are pre-generated characters. So if you're not familiar with this sort of a thing, these are characters normally you would make for a campaign or a series of games. But because this is like a pre-made promotional module, there's pre-generated characters. So, you know, you're not spending an hour or two playing, you know, for a module that you're going to play for a couple hours. So we got a Hakan Wayfarer. We got ourselves a Jolnar, or a Hylar, I guess is the appropriate term, a Hylar Scholar, a Human Soldier, and an Extra Liaison, Kaliri's Liaison. So I guess really the only thing I really have to talk about these is if you're not familiar with the system, it might be interesting to just do a little comparison to how this works with a more familiar system. So let's say we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, which is the most popular system. But it might be interesting to just compare how this works versus the D&D system. So there's a lot of similarities, but some important differences. Primarily the dice, the narrative dice system, I think is kind of a trademark of the Genesys system in general. So the Genesys system that this is based on is a generic system that's supposed to have application in many, many different types of games. So if you're playing a fantasy game, a real world spy adventure, or a sci-fi adventure like this, I should be able to adapt to those. Star Wars Edge of the Empire is based on this system, so if you've played that, it's very similar to this so far, at least from what I can see. There's probably going to be some differences, but it might be interesting to just take a look how this might compare to like a D&D character. So here, let's take a look. We got so stats. So I guess we'll start with that, and I put the I put this in Photoshop, so it's just easy to zoom in and out of the screen. I'm going to take this character. So this is our human. She's the face of the ad campaign here. So if you've ever played D&D before, you'll know how you'll have a series of 6 stats, and these are typically out of 18, although they can be a little higher depending on different modifiers. But generally what you're doing is you're taking like 3 6-sided dice, rolling them, add them together. That's the most base form of character creation in D&D. In this, you'll have base stats based on your race. So this is, I guess, the human starting stats. They can be modified when in character creation. But so a human, for example, is fairly even across the board with their stats, whereas you'll notice the Hylar is very, very smart, but kind of low in the other stuff, right? So these stats are generally out of 5. So 3 being, an average person. What do they mean here? So in Dungeons and Dragons, your 6 stats are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. There's some pretty close comparisons here, but some differences. So brawn, for example, in this one, would represent both your physical strength as well as how kind of tough and solid you are, how fit you are. So it's kind of a combination of D&D's strength and constitution. It kind of covers both of those fields. Agility is a pretty close approximation of agility and dexterity. Would be basically the same thing. And then let's jump ahead to presence. Presence is basically charisma. It's like how much force of personality you have, how much people notice you when you walk in a room. It's essentially charisma. This was where it splits up a little: intellect, cunning, and willpower. And so in D&D, I would say these kind of split between intelligence and wisdom. So intellect here is kind of your education, your base of knowledge, also how well you can analyze data and information and extrapolate information, figure things out, like, good puzzle solver, good education, good learning. Cunning seems like more like how well you are to notice things, how quick you are on your feet. So it's kind of, you see that a lot with wisdom in Dungeons and Dragons, but elements of intelligence to it. Like, you can read a situation very quickly. It's kind of connected to intellect, kind of connected to, D&D's wisdom. Willpower is kind of your strength of determination and self-discipline. Okay, so I would say in D&D, these 3 kind of get, intelligence and wisdom, and these kind of split those out a little bit more. So very much like D&D, there's a skill list. In this case, they're only listing the skills that this character has proficiencies in. Now, in a Dungeons and Dragons sheet, you'd have a number instead of a dice pool for these. And what that number would mean is you have modifiers. Like if you were very, very strong physically, you might have a bonus to athletics. Well, they do, because that's actually one of the skills in D&D is athletics. And so if you have very high strength, you're going to have a bonus in athletics. If you have very low strength, you might have a negative in athletics. In this case, it's measured by a dice pool. And so we're going to talk about the dice in a bit. But in this case, the green dice, the number of dice actually would represent how many dice they have in that attribute. So in this case, any brawn-based skills, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse cursor on this recording, but any brawn-based skill would have 2 dice. And by default, to someone who's not proficient, there would be 2 green dice, so these green diamonds. But for every rank of proficiency, so in this case here, you can see our human soldier here, Jaina, has 1 rank, which lets her upgrade one of these green dice into a yellow die. So that means she's got 2 brawn and 1 rank in proficiency. So with coercion, which is a willpower skill, she gets a total of 3 dice for her 3 willpower. And because she has 2 ranks in it, so she's trained in coercion, she upgrades 2 of those dice. So, and then anything she's not trained in, you don't need to put on this chart, because she's just going to take a number of green dice equal to whatever her ability is. Okay, so a little bit of a difference. So with in D&D, you're taking a number, a modifier, you're rolling a 20-sided die and adding that number to it, or subtracting if you're really bad at it. In this case, it's modifying a dice pool, which again we'll talk about shortly. Another big difference is how armor works. So in this game, we have soak. So soak is going to be a combination typically of your physical self how solid and tough you are as a person, plus any armor you might be wearing or shields you might have. So in this case, Jaina has a soak of 4. 2 of that will be from her brawn, and then she's probably wearing some kind of armor or something. I don't know how to find it on here or if it's even on here. But anyway, and it might work differently than it does in Star Wars. I don't know. But basically what soak is that in Dungeons and Dragons, when somebody rolls an attack, your armor is added to the difficulty that you are to hit. So it actually just makes you harder to hit in general. So people either hit or miss you. In this, the armor doesn't protect you from being hit, but what it does is it absorbs the impact. So if somebody comes up and hits you in the chest with a hammer, you might feel it through the chest, but the damage will be reduced because of your armor and also how just actually physically tough you are. All right, and then they kind of split in D&D. You have hit points, which is a measure of your health, and when those hit 0, you're down. In the Genesys system, at least in the Star Wars and this system, apparently, you have both wound thresholds and strain thresholds, and this is how much you can take before you're incapacitated. So wounds measure what you would think more traditionally as physical damage, like you've been stabbed or shot in the face or something like that. That's going to add to your wound threshold. But strain has to do with things like physical exertion and exhaustion. So they won't necessarily kill you, but it can still incapacitate you. You could just collapse from exhaustion in a fight, or undergo a lot of stress and just kind of collapse on the floor, curl up in the fetal position, whatever. So various things can add strain. Strain tends to go away maybe a little quicker. And you can push yourself. Often when you're doing your turns, you get like a certain number of actions, just like in D&D. But you can take strain or exert yourself a little further to do something extra, which is a neat feature. Okay, so you don't want either of these to hit 0, though, in a fight. Another thing it adds is critical injuries. So you not only take straight damage with wounds, you can also take temporary or permanent injuries. So for example, you could get hit in the ankle, and maybe for your next turn, you can't move as far or at all, but then it goes away. Or maybe you like lose an arm, and that's like permanent, unless you can get it healed somehow. So that's added to. So it's kind of a very dynamic system for injuries and wounds. All right, and then let's take a look at the dice pool, because I think this is, in my experience, maybe the most definitive and interesting element of this system is actually how the dice work. So I've often heard these referred to as narrative dice, and I often hear the D&D system referred to as binary dice. So, and what they mean by binary is that when you roll your dice in D&D, you're either going to get a success or failure. And there's a little bit of variation to that, such as critical successes and critical failures, which not everybody plays with. But for the most part, it's either succeed or fail, right? So these dice are designed to be a little bit more dynamic. And so instead of numbers, you'll notice these dice all have symbols. Here, I'll see if I can zoom in a little more here. Hopefully you guys are seeing this. Okay, hold on a second. There we go. I hope that's big enough for you. Okay, so there are 6 kinds of dice. Some are good and some are bad. And you'll remember when we were looking at Jaina's stats, or her skills, I mean, she had some green diamonds and some yellow, I think they were hexagons, so they represented these 2 dice. So what that means is if she's trying to do something, she's going to look at her skill, and then that pool. So let's say she's trying to jump from one building to another. And so the GM says, okay, you're going to have to roll athletics to make that jump. And so she's going to look at her dice pool and say, okay, so I've got a brawn of 2. But I'm proficient in athletics, which lets me upgrade one of those to a yellow. So the player is going to roll a green die and a yellow die. So yellow die is kind of a better version of a green die. Okay. And then the GM will decide, well, what's the difficulty of this jump? So if it's not a very hard jump, you might say, well, it's just 1 purple die. So that's your difficulty die. It's a difficulty of 1. It's not too hard, but you still have to roll because, failure could mean falling between the 2 buildings. Or maybe it's a bit of a jump. You might say 2 dice or even 3 dice. Okay, so so you're rolling these dice against. Typically, you're rolling these dice against this die. right? So she runs, makes the jump, and then you're going to roll these and compare the symbols. So with these symbols on this die, you're going to have successes and advantages, okay? And on the difficulty die, you're going to have failures and threats. The proficiency die, the yellow one, can also potentially add a triumph. So how it works is you roll this dice, and every success and every success and every failure will cancel out until you have an extra of one or the other, or they both just completely cancel out. If you have at least one success more than failures, you've succeeded at the task. And you can scale it. So let's say she makes this jump and she succeeds with one. You might read very close. Let's say she just managed to grab the edge and pull herself up. Whereas if she rolls 3 successes, she just sails across, lands, does a pirouette, lands on her feet, fantastic. On the other hand, a failure, so even one failure more than success, she doesn't make it, and the impact of the fall might be related by how much she failed. A lot of this would be up to the GM's discretion. But in addition to the pass fail, there's also advantage versus threat. And so what you're going to do is all these dice will also come up with advantage and threat. So I might end up with a success, but also I have more threat than I rolled for. Oh my goodness, it's very confusing me. So despair, sorry. You have more advantage than despair. So, or threat. I've just confused myself. Success compares to failure, advantage compares to threat. So you're going to compare your advantage to your threats. And if you have more advantage than threat, something advantageous will occur, whether you succeeded or failed. If you end up with more threat, something disadvantageous will occur even if you succeeded. So, for example, let's say she makes the jump. She's rolled more successes than failures. But let's say she also rolled more threats than advantages. So maybe she makes the jump only to find out there's 2 enemies waiting on the other side on the next building, blocking her escape, right? Or likewise, she could fail. So let's say she fails the jump, but she rolls a bunch of advantage. So maybe she actually falls down the side of the building, but just a story down, there's a balcony which she can slip into and actually get out of view of whoever's pursuing her, right? So this allows for very dynamic situations. You have to be kind of quick on your feet, especially as the GM, to kind of throw these so they run smoothly into a narration, but it's very interesting. And there is some helpers for it, because a lot of times you'll have charts on how to spend your advantage and threats, right? So you could say, okay, so I roll, let's say I'm the GM and the player rolls to threat while they're firing a carbine. Well, you could say, okay, well, this says I can spend 2 threat to make their battery pack die out, right? Or whatever. So you'll have charts that can help you, so you don't have to think of stuff every time, but you can get really creative and have a lot of fun with just coming up with what these could entail. And then the other 2 I haven't talked about yet are the triumphs and the despairs. And so you'll notice this is the yellow die. So the yellow die is the upgraded green die, basically. But what it has is it adds a triumph, and a triumph is kind of a super success. So you've not only succeeded, but you succeeded with great grace. And quite often, especially if you're using weapons and tools, you might have a special bonus you can use with a triumph. So for example, if you're shooting your weapon at someone and you roll a triumph, you might be able to spend that to cause a critical injury to whoever you hit. Likewise, despair comes on this red die. Now the red die comes in special situations, like if you're fighting like a big boss, or something in a particularly threatening situation, the GM might throw one of these in there. And if they roll a despair, it's a horrific failure. So this would be like your D&D critical failure, right? So yeah, these can be a lot of fun. I actually really enjoy the dice system. It's one of my favorite dice systems in any of the types of games, role-playing game dice systems that I've tried. So cool. Well, unfortunately, okay, a bit of time to wait for Embers of the Imperium to come out. But in a few months' time, I hope to be able to show you a little bit more about this, the module Ashes of Power that's going to come out, with what seems like these characters here. All right. Well, anyways, hopefully that was somewhat interesting and or informative. But either way, have a good evening.